Holy Mother, look at her eyes!
What paralyzing sickness is this? Bridget, wake!
On a bitter winter morning in 1346, a Swedish noblewoman suddenly fell to the floor during Mass. Her name was Bridget, 43 years old, a widow, and mother to 8 children who had all survived infancy, a rare blessing in that harsh century. What occurred to her that frozen day in Faustina would go on to reshape the Church's understanding of confession forever. The priests carried her to a side chapel. Her body was rigid, her eyes open but unseeing. Her pulse was faint. They prepared the last rites, assuming she was dying. She wasn't dying. She was watching something no living person should see. When Bridget finally woke 3 hours later, she was weeping. Not the gentle tears of piety, the violent gasping sobs of someone who had witnessed an atrocity. The priests leaned in, asking what she had seen. She whispered, "The confessional is a battlefield." They didn't understand. Not yet. Over the next 27 years, Bridget would receive over 700 visions, meticulously recorded by her confessors. The Church examined every word. Theologians debated them. Some called her a prophet. Others whispered darker accusations. But there was one vision the Church struggled with more than any other. The vision about what really happens in the invisible world when someone confesses a sin. And it wasn't what anyone expected. Bridget's first vision of the confessional came 6 months after her collapse. She was praying in her room when the walls seemed to dissolve. She described it later as if reality itself had peeled back, revealing the scaffolding underneath. Before her stood a confessional booth, but it wasn't empty. Inside, she could see 2 figures. One was a young man, kneeling, head bowed. The other was the priest, listening. But that's not all she saw. Standing behind the priest was something she initially thought was an angel. Tall, radiant, holding what looked like a basin of water. Its face was expressionless, watchful. And behind the young man, crouched low, almost hidden in shadow, was something else. Something with too many fingers. The young man began to confess. Bridget couldn't hear the words, but she could see the effect. Every time he spoke, the thing behind him flinched, its fingers twitched, its form seemed to grow thinner, more transparent, and the angel behind the priest began to pour the water, not onto the ground, onto the young man's head. Bridget watched as the water, glowing faintly like liquid moonlight, washed over him. Where it touched, the shadows clinging to his shoulders evaporated. The crouched thing behind him let out a soundless scream, and then it was gone. But here's where it gets strange. The angel didn't stop pouring. Even after the creature vanished, the water kept flowing. It pooled at the young man's feet, then began to spread across the floor, under the door, out into the church. Bridget followed it with her eyes. The water was flowing toward other people in the church, people who weren't confessing, people who were simply praying or sitting in silence or lighting candles. When the water touched them, she saw something flicker above their heads, brief images. Faces of people they'd wronged, sins they'd forgotten, moments of cruelty or cowardice they'd buried, and then, one by one, those people stood up and walked toward the confessional. Bridget wrote, "One man's true confession becomes a net that catches others." The Church didn't know what to do with that. 3 years later, Bridget had a second vision. This time, she saw the opposite. A woman entered the confessional, well-dressed, composed. She knelt and began listing her sins in a calm, measured voice. Bridget couldn't hear the words, but she could see the woman's face. No tears, no trembling, no fear. Behind the priest, the angel stood as before, holding the basin, but this time, it didn't pour. It waited. Behind the woman, the shadow creature was there too, but unlike before, it wasn't flinching. It was smiling. The woman finished her confession. The priest gave absolution. She made the sign of the cross, stood, and left. The angel never poured the water. The creature followed her out, walking beside her like a loyal dog. Bridget was shaken. She asked in her vision, not aloud but in her mind. Why was she not cleansed? A voice answered. She never described whose voice it was. In her writings, she only said, "I was told." The voice said, she confessed with her mouth, not her heart. She listed sins like items on a merchant's ledger. She wanted the priest's approval, not God's mercy. And so the door remained closed. Bridget pressed further. But the priest gave absolution. Doesn't that count? The voice replied, the priest opens the door, but the sinner must walk through it. And then the vision showed her something that haunted her for the rest of her life. She saw the woman later that same day, at home. The shadow creature was still with her, but now it had grown. It was larger, darker, more solid. It was feeding on something, on her certainty that she was forgiven. Bridget wrote, the greatest weapon of the enemy is a false absolution, not false from the priest, but false in the soul that receives it without sorrow. The theologians who reviewed her writings debated this for years. Some argued it was dangerous, implying that absolution wasn't enough. Others said Bridget was simply emphasizing the necessity of contrition. But there's a detail most people miss. In the margin of the original manuscript, one of her confessors, a Dominican named Peter Olavi, wrote a note. It wasn't meant for publication. It was discovered centuries later, barely legible. It said, I asked Bridget what the creature was feeding on. She said, on the memory of the sin which the woman still loves. That line was never included in the official revelations. By 1350, Bridget's visions about confession had become more specific and more disturbing. She began describing what she called the three chambers of the soul. According to her visions, every human soul has three interior spaces. The first chamber is the mouth, where words are formed. The second is the mind, where intentions are held. The third is the heart, where true sorrow is born. Most people, she said, confess only from the first chamber. They say the right words. They know the formula. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. They list their sins. They receive absolution. They leave. But the words never travel deeper than their throat. Some people confess from the second chamber. They intellectually recognize their sins. They understand why those actions were wrong. They may even feel mild regret. But it's the regret of being caught, or of disappointing someone, or of failing to live up to their own standards, not the regret of wounding God. True confession, Bridget insisted, must come from the third chamber, from the heart. And she described what that looked like in the spiritual realm. When someone confesses from the heart, she said, their soul opens like a flower. Not a metaphor. She meant it literally. In her visions, she saw the soul unfold, petal by petal, revealing the sin nestled inside like a poisonous seed. And then the water from the angel's basin would pour directly into that opening, flushing out the poison, washing the roots clean. But here's the unsettling part. When the soul opened, other things could see inside too. Bridget described watchers in her later visions, beings that stood at a distance, observing every confession. Some were luminous, benevolent. Others were dark, hostile. She wrote, when the soul opens in true sorrow, the angels rejoice and draw near. But when the soul opens in false sorrow, the demons draw near instead, marking the spot where the lie was spoken. One theologian asked her, why would demons care about a false confession? Her answer chilled him. Because they know that soul will return, and next time, the door will be harder to open. In 1356, Bridget had a vision that nearly got her writings condemned. She saw a priest in the confessional, but this time, the priest was the one confessing. To another priest, and behind him, Bridget saw not one shadow creature, but 7. They were wrapped around him like chains, one coiled around his throat, another around his eyes, a third around his hands. The priest confessed his sins. Bridget heard them this time: pride, lust, greed, ordinary sins, the kind any human might fall into. But as he spoke, the creatures didn't flinch. They tightened. The angel behind the other priest lifted the basin, ready to pour. But before the water could flow, something happened. One of the creatures around the confessing priest opened its mouth and spoke. Bridget heard its voice clearly. It said, "He does not mean it." The angel paused. The confessing priest continued, his voice steady, his words perfect. But Bridget could see into his heart, the third chamber. It was closed, locked from the inside, not because he didn't want forgiveness, but because he didn't believe he needed it. He was confessing out of obligation, out of fear of scandal, out of a desire to maintain appearances, but not out of sorrow. The angel slowly lowered the basin, and the creatures tightened further. When the priest left the confessional, Bridget saw something that made her weep. The creatures were now inside him, burrowed into his chest, his mind, his hands. And when he next said Mass, she saw them moving his lips. She wrote, "A priest who confesses without contrition becomes a puppet, and the Mass he offers feeds not the faithful, but the enemy." This passage caused an uproar. Church officials demanded clarification. Was Bridget saying a priest's absolution could be invalid? Was she saying the sacraments didn't work if the priest was in sin? She responded carefully. The sacrament is always valid. God's grace flows through even unworthy hands, but the priest himself receives nothing, and over time, he hollows out. One cardinal asked her, "What does it mean to hollow out?" She said, "He becomes a bridge that others cross, but he himself never reaches the other side." The cardinal never asked her another question. In 1362, Bridget received a vision that explained why true contrition was so powerful. She was shown a memory, not hers, but humanity's. She saw the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve standing before God after the fall, and she saw something no one had ever told her. God asked them a question, not, "Why did you eat the fruit?" but, "Are you sorry?" In Bridget's vision, Adam hesitated. He looked at Eve. He looked at the ground. He opened his mouth to explain, to justify, to deflect blame. And in that hesitation, something entered the world, not sin, that was already there, but the refusal to own it. Bridget wrote, "The first sin was disobedience, but the second sin, the one that made exile necessary, was the refusal to say, 'I am sorry, and it is my fault.'" She saw what would have happened if Adam had simply wept, if he had fallen to his knees and said, "I have ruined everything, and I am sorry." In her vision, God's response was immediate, not anger, not exile, mercy. The tree would have remained forbidden, but the relationship would have been restored. Instead, Adam deflected. "The woman you gave me," and the door closed. Bridget was shown that this pattern repeats in every confession, every time someone says, "I'm sorry," but every time someone confesses while mentally listing excuses, every time someone speaks the words without opening the third chamber. The door closes. Not because God closes it, but because the sinner never opened it in the first place. Bridget's most detailed vision about confession came in 1367. She was elderly by then, living in Rome, her body failing, but her visions were sharper than ever. She saw a courtroom, not on earth, somewhere else. A soul stood in the center, gender unclear, face obscured. Around it were three figures. One was an angel, holding a scroll. One was a demon, holding a chain. One was a human figure, glowing faintly. Bridget understood this was the soul's guardian, what we might call a guardian angel, but older, more primal. The demon spoke first. It unrolled its own scroll, listing every sin the soul had committed. The list was long. Some sins were monstrous: violence, betrayal, cruelty. Others were small, moments of laziness, unkind thoughts, petty lies. But the demon read them all with the same relish. When it finished, it turned to the judge, whose face Bridget could not see, and said, "This soul is mine." The angel unrolled its scroll. It listed every confession the soul had made. There were far fewer entries than on the demon's list. The demon smiled, but then the guardian spoke. It pointed to one confession on the angel's scroll, just one, and said, "This one was true." The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward. Bridget saw the scroll magnify, focusing on that single entry. It was a sin confessed when the soul was 17 years old, a lie told to a friend, a small betrayal. Nothing dramatic. But the confession had been made with such complete sorrow, such total honesty, such raw opening of the heart that it glowed on the scroll like a coal. And from that single glowing confession, light began to spread. It erased the sin it addressed. Then it spread to the sins committed before it, then after it. It moved across the demon's scroll like fire, burning away entry after entry. The demon shrieked, but those sins were never confessed. The guardian replied, "One true confession opens the door for all of them. Grace does not count sins, it counts hearts." The light continued spreading until the demon's scroll was blank. The chain in its hand dissolved. The soul was free. Bridget woke from this vision weeping. She dictated it to her confessor immediately, and he wrote it down word for word. But here's what most people don't know. At the end of the dictation, Bridget added something she had not mentioned in the vision itself. She said, "I was also shown what happens when every confession is false." Her confessor waited. She continued, "The scrolls remain full, and at the judgment, the soul sees them both and realizes, 'I was forgiven 1,000 times, but I never accepted it.'" Her confessor asked, "What happens to that soul?" Bridget's answer was simple. It chooses its own exile. After Bridget's death in 1373, her confessor, Peter Olavi, compiled her visions, but he left out certain details, not because they were heretical, but because they were too specific. In her final years, Bridget had described the mechanics of true contrition, what it actually required, physically and spiritually. She said it involved 3 movements of the soul. First, recognition, seeing the sin clearly without excuse or explanation. Second, remorse, feeling genuine sorrow, not fear of punishment, but grief over the wound caused. Third, renunciation, a firm decision to turn away, even if it means suffering. Most people, she said, stop after the first movement. They recognize the sin. They know it was wrong. But they don't feel remorse. Not really. They feel inconvenience, embarrassment, fear. And so the second movement never happens. Without the second movement, the third is impossible. Bridget described it as trying to open a door with 2 locks. Recognition unlocks the first. Remorse unlocks the second. Renunciation pushes the door open. Most people rattle the handle and assume the door is jammed. It's not jammed. They just haven't unlocked it. Peter Olavi wrote in his private notes, "I asked Saint Bridget if there was any way to force the second movement to manufacture remorse. She said no. Remorse cannot be manufactured. It can only be received." "From where?" he asked. She paused, then said, "From the memory of being loved." Peter didn't understand. She explained, "You cannot feel sorrow for wounding someone unless you first remember that they loved you." "That's why," she said. "The first step of any true confession is not listing sins, it's remembering God's love. Without that memory, confession is just inventory." Bridget's revelations about confession were officially approved by the Church in 1391. But certain passages were marked as for private meditation only. One of those passages described a phenomenon Bridget called the echo. She claimed that every true confession creates a ripple in the spiritual world, not just for the person confessing, but for everyone connected to that sin. If you confess a lie you told to a friend, and your confession is true from the heart, that friend feels something, not consciously, but somewhere deep in their soul, a weight lifts. They don't know why. They might feel suddenly lighter or more forgiving or less bitter. And if that friend has been carrying their own unforgiven sin, perhaps resentment toward you, the echo of your confession makes it easier for them to confess theirs. Bridget described it as a chain reaction. One true confession can trigger a dozen others. She wrote, "This is why the enemy fights so hard to keep confessions shallow, because one deep confession can undo a century of his work." Peter Olavi asked her, "Have you ever seen this happen?" She said yes. Once. In Faustina, a man confessed to stealing from the church. It was a true confession. He wept, he returned the money, he begged forgiveness. Within a month, 7 other people in the town came forward with their own confessions. None of them knew about the first man. But Bridget saw the connection in a vision. The water from the first confession had spread through the town like a flood, softening hearts, loosening tongues, unlocking doors. By the end of the year, the entire town had gone to confession. The priest told Bridget it was a miracle. She corrected him. It was one honest man. There's a story that isn't in any official church document. It appears only in a letter from Peter Olavi to another Dominican, written in 1374, a year after Bridget's death. In the letter, Peter describes something Bridget told him on her deathbed. She had asked to make her final confession. Peter heard it, gave absolution, and assumed that was the end. But Bridget stopped him. She said, "There's one more." Peter waited. She confessed that she had once doubted God's mercy. Not dramatically, not publicly, but once, decades ago, after confessing a particularly shameful sin, she had left the confessional and thought, "That can't be enough. God cannot forgive that." It was a brief thought, a flash of doubt, but she had never confessed it, because she was ashamed of doubting. Peter gave her absolution, and then Bridget said something that Peter never forgot. She said, "I just saw them." "Saw who?" Peter asked. "All the people I would have helped if I had confessed that doubt sooner." Peter didn't understand. Bridget explained, "That doubt lived in me for 30 years, and every time someone came to me seeking counsel, that doubt whispered, 'Don't tell them it's easy. Don't tell them God is merciful. You don't even believe it yourself.'" She had spent 30 years advising people, consoling them, guiding them toward confession, but always with a hidden hesitation, a tiny, invisible crack in her confidence. And now, in her final vision, she saw all the people who had sensed that hesitation and held back, who had almost confessed but stopped because they felt her doubt. She wept. Not for her own sin, but for theirs. Peter Olavi wrote, "She taught me that unconfessed sin does not only damn the sinner, it silences them, and in that silence, others are lost." The letter ends there. It was never published, but it was preserved in a monastery in Uppsala, hidden in a bundle of personal correspondence. It wasn't discovered until 1923. And when it was, the Church quietly archived it. Not because it was heretical, but because it was too true. Bridget's final written words, dictated hours before her death, were these: "If you take nothing else from my life, take this. The confessional is not a courtroom. It is an operating room, and the surgeon is not the priest. The priest only opens the door. The surgeon is God. And he is waiting. He has always been waiting. The question is not whether he is ready. The question is whether you will lie still on the table and let him cut away what is killing you." She paused, then added, "Most people leave before the surgery begins. They come in, describe their symptoms, and leave. And they wonder why nothing changes." Peter Olavi asked her, what should they do instead? She smiled. "Bleed on the table, let him see everything, hold nothing back, not out of fear but out of trust, because a surgeon cannot heal what you hide from him." Those were her last words. She died that night. And according to Peter's account, she died smiling. When they prepared her body for burial, they found something unexpected. Carved into her palm, so faint it was almost invisible, were 3 words. No one knows when she carved them, or how, or why. The words were in Latin, cor non verba, heart, not words. The Church never officially explained the marking, but those who knew Bridget understood. She had marked herself with the lesson of her life. God doesn't count your words. He weighs your heart. And if your heart is true, even once, even for a moment, he will move heaven and earth to save you. Amen. Let's meet in the comments.